Okay, well, what I am grateful for is to talk about Luke with you, because we're in lectionary year C. And, just as a way of introduction, in year A, we do Mark. No, I did that wrong. In year A, we do Matthew. In year B, we do Mark. In year C, we do Luke. And we do it in a funny way where the Gospel of John creeps in every year during Eastertide, which is like 8 weeks. And sometimes John will show up in ordinary time, like toward the tail of the summer. Like we just got through I am the bread of life, like 7 weeks in a row. And that came in the year of Mark, which we just closed, right? But that's how the lectionary cycles us through. So a lot going on in Luke, and grateful for your reading this often ignored book. What I wanted to do is, I don't know the right format. So we read the introduction and the first 4 chapters for today, theoretically. And there's a couple of ways to do this. You could say like, hey, I'd like to talk about this phrase in the book or this other phrase in Luke that I don't know that the book did what I wanted it to do. Or there's some questions in the book that are kind of peppered through that I could ask and see where you're going. Or you could just say, hey, Mike, you probably know the author. Like, what do you think the author was thinking when he wrote that? So I don't want to be too rigid in the form, but I will say if we can't think of, if there's no burning questions, I'll come back to the questions from the reading. Does that make sense? So let me start by opening the floor. Feel free to talk about Luke and not about that book. That's totally fine.
Well, it's been, excuse me, a little while since I have read those first 4 chapters. I decided this morning that I really like the book. I think you offer us a lot, and I'm sorry that more people have not been interested in it, but we are the lucky few, so we can enjoy it. So, I like things, scripture studies that bring us into our current world situation. In other words, not how we need to know, have some understanding of the culture in which these gospels were written, but but even knowing that situation, how does that speak to us in our situation? And do we need to make any additions or any subtractions or changes or anything of that sort? So that's why I value these kinds of discussions with this book. And I'll be quiet because, like I said, it's been a while since I've read the first 4 chapters.
Thank you. Thank you.
What is it that you would like for us to get from this book, Mike?
Well, I hope what I said in the introduction is right. Sometimes I think I want people to get one thing out of a book, but I think the introduction is about like, hey, are there extra layers, to be honest, right? And maybe these layers aren't the ones that taste good to you, or maybe we have to acclimatize our palate to think a little differently. But I think the goal is like, hey, are there some extra flavors to our spirituality, to our reading of Luke? And so if I do that, then I feel really good about it, even if they're like one-offs, Yeah. Darlene, looks like you're ready.
Yes, I really liked the statement on page 2, first paragraph, where you're talking about God lovers, and it says, perhaps God lover doesn't mean contemporary Christian consumer, cloistered monastic, or denominationally branded, confessed, confirmed, and communicated Christian. And you go on to talk about perhaps this described people who wonder about life, love, justice, and peace, and what that has to do with humanity. And I think that ties in with what Meg was saying. What does being a God lover mean in terms of our lives and how we live that out? my history in denominations, branded denominations, is that if I were to question, to wonder, to say perhaps this means something different, or perhaps this means what this means to me is this.
Yeah.
I was not branded a God lover. It was the opposite. It was being a heretic or being on the outside. So I really appreciate the approach to wondering and questioning and searching, the appreciation for that in this book and in St. Thomas, coming from you.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a great deal. So that particular phrase resonated with you.
Right. Redefining what God lovers are, who we are, because I see us as God lovers.
Yes.
Can I ask you a weird question, Darlene? And it's okay if it's weird. It's not in your thinking, but I was talking to somebody recently about, and we've done this in some small groups before, about the relationship between cursing and loving. And somebody told me, like, look, if you curse somebody, you can't possibly love them. But I think I'm coming to a different point of view on that. And I wonder if you have any thoughts, like, hey, actually cursing somebody might mean there's some, like, a fundamental trust or expectation here. And I don't know if that resonates with you at all, like in moments of cognitive dissonance, or like, God, you've let me down. To be able to say that could actually be an expression of love instead of hatred.
For me, it's an act of trust, trusting that person or our God to understand our pain, our anger, our quest, our lack of understanding. For me, when we feel so strongly to curse someone or something, or to rail against, there's an intimacy, a connection there, and we're longing for a closeness. We're crying out against whatever it is that is in between us and that person or that God.
Yeah. There's this line from Julian of Norwich where she says, God, I see how you treat your friends, and I understand why you don't have very many.
Sometimes the cursing is just frustration too. And that is maybe an expression of disappointment, of hurt, or it doesn't mean that you hate the person or anything. It's just a way of venting too.
I really appreciate you saying that, Megan. I may be off the topic of what Darlene brought up. In like my own head, the way this starts to spin out, because Darlene mentioned her past, there were things I wasn't allowed to say or think in church because they were like the wrong things. And if you thought or said those things, you would be like disrespecting God. And I've come to realize as I've grown in my marriage that if my wife can't tell me how she's feeling, I need to grow up. Sometimes she'll tell me how she's feeling, and instead of that comprising the relationship, it allows the relationship to go forward. So she could say, like, God, I hate you did this thing. And my early church brain is like, oh no, my wife hates me. Instead of like, oh, she trusts me enough to tell me that this thing I did drove her off a cliff. And she trusts that I can fix it because she trusts that I love her. It's like this like totally different perspective that I've had since being married 10 years. The first 10 years I got away without it, not very well.
Going back to what Darlene said in the beginning about God lovers, I really wonder, excuse me, how many people really consider themselves God lovers. For most people, the truth of the matter is today, there are really not all that many real Christians anymore. Yeah, they go to church on Sunday, and they say the good things on Sunday, and then the rest of the week they live like everybody else who are even like the non-believers. We see a lot of that in Christianity now today, where you, people are not, the poor are not helped, and people are discriminated against and all that stuff. But the point is, I'm glad you had this in the beginning here, because, really a God lover is someone who has a personal, conscious relationship with God. In other words, God is not just somebody I talk to in the morning and then I go about my work during the day. God is someone who goes with me through my work during the day. Or God is not something that I just do on Sundays, but it is a year-round thing. It can, in other words, it's like God becomes real, not up there, not up in the sky, but God becomes real because God lives here in us. And so the God lover to me is the relationship that we develop over time with God. It doesn't happen just like that. It takes effort on our part, openness, and listening to God too. So I think that Luke is a good example of how you become a God lover if you don't feel that you are there yet. But it is a lifetime quest. But God lets you in as he sees your sincerity in responding to God. And for me, God is male and female. So when I speak of God, I'm talking about the male side of God and the female side of God. And the only reason that we have God as strictly male is because the only people who could write when they wrote the scriptures were men. And so we have the whole scriptures from a male perspective. So I think we ladies, need to say, okay, we have the right as women created by God to worship the feminine God, because actually there's no sex in God, but God is both. Okay, I guess I digressed a little bit there, but anyway, that's part of being a God lover too. Yeah, saying, hey,
Thank you. And it really reminds me what you're saying, and like in the context of this quote from Rumi, beyond right and wrong, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And I wonder if that isn't in fact like God's invitation to us. So like expanding that notion of what God loving can be. It's just, anyway, to me seems compelling.
It is the most beautiful experience you could ever have in your life. There is nothing that compares to it. You will be surprised at what God will do for you if you really make God the center of your life.
Thanks, Meg. Anthony, were you getting ready to hop on? I couldn't tell.
Are we ready to change topics? Because I had another bit that I like.
This is your time, not mine.
All right. Actually, in the next chapter, you ask the question about angels being messengers and whether angels could actually be us and what messages would God have us deliver. And that was one that sent me into a lot of deep thought about because one of the messages that I hear from you a lot that I really appreciate and really resonates with me is this idea of connecting with people and connecting with people that aren't exactly the same as us and building bridges. And I personally keep struggling about how to really go about doing that. Definitely that's a message that I'd like to be sharing more.
Could I put you on the spot? Are there angels or archangels from your life you'd share with us? You don't have to name them.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that, Mike.
I can give you a break. So I'll give you a break and I'll say like 2 archangels in my life whom I've never met. Well, actually I did meet her for a little bit. Brene Brown and Marshall Rosenberg, because they gave me like a framework to think not only about the relationship I have with all the different parts of myself, right, with other people. And like some of the prophetic words of Brene Brown, right, are instead of judging people for the burdens they carry, wonder at how they're able to carry them, like wonder with awe, right? And Marshall Rosenberg saying that the highest, and he's quoting somebody, but the highest form of human intelligence is to observe without evaluating. Like, these are archangels for me. And one of them was Jewish and one of them was Episcopalian. And I already quoted that thing from Rumi, which I'm only starting to even have any understanding of. Beyond right and wrong, there's a field, I'll meet you there. These people didn't have wings. They didn't have wings. They didn't have visible halos, but I see the halo in these, like in these words, right? And my mom, who doesn't always get the words right, has almost visible wings because she gets it right. You know, like she gets it right. Like these are like archangels of the heavenly host in my life. Did I give you enough time?
Brene Brown is definitely a good one. To that, I would add Jimmy Carter, more by his post-presidential action than, although I've read his written word too, but that he has gone out into the world and with his work for Habitat and his work for peace has really gone out and done a lot of good things in our world. I think he's our best ex-president.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share an angel, whether embodied or disembodied?
Hi, Mike.
Hey, Lila.
So I just want to say, I get really great messages from you and sweet darling Darlene, and also from my friend Melinda, who called me up 2 days after reading her chat, saying, "Funny what's happened. We found you a dog." And I wouldn't have taken it seriously, I think, if anyone but her. That was the real message. And she got me new doggo.
Lila, it was a little spotty. Let me see if I heard it right. You've had some strong messages from folks here, and especially Darlene, and well, yeah, okay, thanks. I don't need to repeat that part. And also from Rennie, your departed therapy dog.
Yes. And also from my friend Melinda, who called me up 2 days after Rennie had passed, saying, "We think we found you a new dog."
Yeah. Who is in the car with you right now?
She is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I do wonder about the content of being angelic messengers and what content we're invited to share. It seems really important. Can I ask you one of the other book chapters? This is for anybody. And by the way, if you got something else, jump in. You know, I shared this idea that Mary was maybe just the first person who said yes. Like God had been showing up for tens of thousands of years, and Miriam said no, and Wanda said no, and Elizabeth said no, and then Mary was like, okay. And I don't know if that touched you, but it's interesting for me to think about what is God inviting us to say yes to. Sometimes it could be really scandalous. And I wonder, not if that resonated with you, but rather if there was a connection. And I think this again would be somebody in your life probably who you perceive has said yes to God, or a time in which you've said yes, maybe when you didn't have to, and maybe it caused temporary discomfort, but it was creative.
Well, I think angels can come to us in many different ways. I remember one time when I was traveling between Houston and Port Arthur, where I lived at that time, and this was a while back. I've got decades behind me, but I had a flat tire on 45 going south, or whatever. That ain't 40. That's not 45. Anyway, going toward Port Arthur, and there was nobody around. It was just like there was no traffic on the road that day. And anyway, so I pulled over, and I was thinking, oh dear God, what am I going to do about this now? And but anyway, this elderly couple pulled up behind me, and so I got out to go meet them, and I thought, that man doesn't look like he's old. He's really old, and he doesn't look like he's going to be able to handle a heavy tire. But anyway, he and his wife were just lovely, and they said, well, just go get in your car, and we'll take care of the tire. So I went and sat in the car, and I really didn't hear much of anything. But then eventually I got out and went back to check them, and they were standing there. And no, they weren't standing there. They were gone, but the tire was fixed. Now, those weren't angels. I don't know what they were, but they were really lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna try to talk. I have 3 boys that are like wrestling on my bed. So the idea of Mary being the first person to say yes, I don't know, it just makes me think about this idea of like how, I don't know, it's not really a clear thought, I guess, but just this idea of like how, is there like a preparation, or is like God preparing you throughout your life for that time when you say yes? Or like, I don't know if that makes sense, but like, is that like that process, like it's always there and you just have to be ready to, like, I don't know, you just go through life and you have different experiences, and then one day your eyes are open, I guess,
I don't need to be the first to respond. I'm always excited to be. Let me see if there's somebody else who wants to share their wisdom on that. Okay, well, I'm going to tell you, from my evangelical days, we memorized Romans 8:28. In all things, God works for the good of those who love God and are called according to God's purpose, right? But there's a variation on that, which is, in all things, God is able to work to the good of those who love God. And I sort of think about, like, because I've got the Protestant work ethic in mind, like really strong, I'm afraid of wasting time. But I think there's this sort of like promise that no matter where we've been, whether it's in rehab or postgraduate school, if we're willing, God is able to like engineer that to the good of us, like to our joy, not because we got extra marks or something, but like into this discernment and the possibility. And sometimes I'm afraid, like I grew up, that God's got a perfect plan for your life. And if you pick the wrong thing, then you just like screwed it up, and now you're going to get a B in life, and it seems like that's against grace, right? The idea is like there's really no missteps, because if God is omnipresent, like you're walking in God all the time, especially when you don't know it. And maybe that's the promise of redemption. Now, look, I resist this reading that says like, well, God gave me an alcohol addiction so I could minister to alcoholics. That's crazy. However, if you find yourself with an alcohol addiction, I don't think that's outside of God's ability to work redemptively. So I got to pull the cause out, but I think the effect might end up being the same. And, it's just sort of weird. Like I think about things I've done that at the time, well, I just keep finding them show up, and like some of I'm doing this outdoor course on my sabbatical, and I've already started thinking like, well, what can I do with that? Not just, hey, I'm going to go in the woods for 51 days, but what could I do with a wilderness first responder certification on behalf of the Diocese of Texas or the Church with a capital C? I'm going to ask the bishop that question on Thursday, and hopefully he is smarter than I am. But I sort of think like, instead of like, can God do this? it invites us to this mentality to like, oh, okay, like what's the possibility here? And this story is really interesting because it's like a scandal. Like being an unwed mother is like we tell our daughters, like, don't do that. But then we've got this core story in the Bible that only works if she does that. I like increasingly think it's really weird what we act out with kids. Noah's Ark. I think it's a dreadful story. The Exodus story. Yeah. There's a lot of collateral damage in that story. You know, like it's awful. Like lots of people die and animals die, and we do that. Like look, kids, it's the plague of the frogs. You know, but like it had to be terrible. I mean, it just really terrible. And then here's Mary, right? Who maybe like her life is in jeopardy because she'll get called a prostitute. And I don't have much doubt that Jesus grew up his whole life being called a bastard. I don't have much doubt of that. And yet, like, God took this like scandal and engineered it to be life-giving. And yet, and consider this is about pregnancy. And yet, like, culturally, we shame women for being pregnant out of wedlock when, like, that's our core story. We shame women for all kinds of things. We punish prostitutes, not Johns, right? We have bills that punish women for being pregnant, not men for being involved in pregnancy. We come back to the story every year. We have kids act it out and they say like, oh, like virgin birth, and they're like 8 and it's cute, but like, I don't want my kid having a virgin birth. I want her to be like 30, you know, and in a committed relationship. So it's interesting how we balance out the scandal of what God's able to do, and we normalize the Mary story. Like, oh, this story is a one-off. Like, you can only do this one time, and it's just her. Instead of like, hey, what ways do we actually resonate with the story, and what way is this an invitation to kind of say yes, even if there's going to be collateral damage for us?
Well, you know, Mike, there's another twist to that story too. When you consider the culture in which Mary lived, you remember that the Romans were very much in control, and the people suffered terribly. I mean, hunger and starvation were common fare for the day because of the heavy taxation and stuff like that. But there was also this other fact of history that Roman soldiers raped women whenever they wanted to, you know, and there's highly possible that Mary is a rape victim, which speaks all the more to the majesty and the grace and the beauty of what God has done, and bringing the Creator out of that situation, and in a situation that we can relate to. So, in a way, it doesn't really. Well, I guess it does matter how Mary got pregnant, but I definitely don't think she was loose. I don't think she made a mistake. I think she was raped, or she was abused by someone who gave her no choice. But the point is, God took that and worked with it and put his son in that baby's body that was developing.
Another thought. I mean, not necessarily about that, but just about the opportunity to say yes in different situations. Like, it's not just one yes for eternity, you know. I think it's like a daily yes of making choices or being presented with things, and sometimes it's a no, right? But it's like it's this journey versus just like yes and then you're good forever, you know. Anyway,
thank you. I really appreciate that. Anthony,
I actually had a bit of a struggle with this story, in that the angel tells her son's going to be king. And that's breaking free from the Romans. That's really what he doesn't tell her is he's playing a really long game, because if he'd been the secular king, right, and been just a person, he would have been gone 2,000 years ago and he would not have a kingdom now. But he does because of the arc of his story. But Mary doesn't get told the way he's going to be king. So she's actually got another, as a mother, losing your 30-year-old son that's a tragedy. And losing him that way is, a mega tragedy. And she wasn't told that was part of this deal.
Yeah, thank you. There's a poem by this lady called Martha Porter. She's an Episcopal priest. And she writes this poem like, did the lady know when she held the baby did the lady say on Christmas Eve when she held the baby, this is my body, this is my blood? Did the lady say when she held her dead son off the cross, this is my body, this is my blood? Which are the words of institution at the Eucharist, right? This is my body, this is my blood. And like the way of framing that and the potential just pathos of that, and like you say, the disappointment that almost certainly was there in every possible level is it's shattering. And we split that. We usually think like, Mary, did you know? Yeah, she knew. But how does anybody know what it's like to have your heart broken?
And I wonder how Mary interpreted, your son's going to be king and king forever.
And we talk about this on Christ the King Sunday. I mean, if Jesus is the king, really, like we're either really bad subjects or he's not much different from medieval kings that were not mostly good. I mean, like the world is not a heavenly kingdom. So either we're not doing what we're supposed to do or the kingship is bad. And I think that invites us into some cognitive dissonance, right? About like, what does it really mean to be the anointed one?
Well, when the Hebrews first wanted kings, didn't God say, you guys don't really want this?
Yeah, and you got to give them a little compassion there, because Samuel was like the prophet and priest who acted like the king, and his sons were awful. Like they were liars, they were taking advantage of women, they were stealing money, and the people were like, Samuel, we see what's coming down the pipeline. We don't want any of that. And he was like, well, if you don't want my sons, then you're disobeying God. So I think it's fair to have compassion that like, hey, not all kids are like their parents. And Samuel might have been a decent guy, but his kids weren't. So what choice did the people have? At least a king could be different from Samuel's like wicked children. Maybe they weren't in the end, but there was a chance.
Mike, could you put in the chat the name of that poem and the author?
Yeah, I will.
That has really, really touched my heart this morning.
To me, it's extremely evocative. And if you want, Darlene, I'll type the poem in, because I don't know that you'll find it in regular publication.
Okay.
It's in this book, which won't show up very well, called the Nicene Creed. I have 2 copies of this in my office, but I feel comfortable writing this poem when I find it.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, if you can type it out, why don't you just email it to everybody?
Well, that's a good idea, isn't it? I should do that. I think
That's probably easier than trying to put it in chat.
I'm going to read the whole thing to you anyway, because I found it.
Okay, where's the box of Kleenex then?
Did the woman say, when she held him for the first time in the dark dank of a stable, after the pain and the bleeding and the crying, this is my body, this is my blood? Did the woman say, when she held him for the last time in the dark rain on a hilltop, after the pain and the bleeding and the dying, this is my body, this is my blood? I'll email it to you. Happy to do it.
Thank you.
I don't know if you know this or not, but there's this famous sculpture by Michelangelo called the Pieta, and it's in the Vatican. Has anybody seen it in person?
Yes.
I almost cried when I saw it because it looks like a human being. It doesn't look like stone. I mean, the stone is so smooth that it's flesh-like, but not everybody knows that Mary is 1.635 times the size of Jesus, which is like the golden ratio in art. It's like the seismographic difference in chambers in a nautilus and the number of like drones to workers in a beehive, like in every beehive. So it's like this divine proportion. It's also the Fibonacci sequence. When you take a limit of it to infinity, it comes to this ratio. And it's interesting to think about Mary being bigger than Jesus in that moment.
Mike, can you hear me?
Yes.
So if you could talk to us a little bit about the comparison between Elizabeth and Zechariah, echoing back to Abraham and Sarah, a child of old age.
Yeah.
But now the young woman is bearing the prophet. And this part about John being the new Elijah, I just find that fascinating. And I'm not sure the meaning between the contrast of the two pregnancies.
So this is what the Bible loves to do, the New Testament loves to do, is take a core Jewish story and then say, like, here we go again. Now, Matthew calls this fulfilling the words of the prophet. And we do ourselves an injustice when we say, like, oh, prophets predict the future and then it happens just like they said. Instead, this pattern is like, oh, like we're finding ourselves in this place we found ourselves in once before. Some of the circumstances are different, but we're going to resonate with this story. And this happens every year if you're Jewish. Like, Jewish time isn't a wheel. It's more like a spring that's going somewhere, but has these repetitions in it every year. By the way, we do this in the church here when we have Advent and Epiphany and Christmas, like every year, where there's these like resonances in time that we find ourselves in. They're not loops because they're different, but they're like well-burned tracks that we find ourselves walking again and again. So the first thing maybe, Lila, is like there's this resonance story with these people who have a promise, God's favor, who aren't exactly experiencing favor. They don't have a kid, which is the most important thing you can have. Otherwise, your name dies with you. Or like Mary's this peasant lady and things aren't going according to plan, because when you get pregnant before you're married, like that's can be really, really bad, right? So there's like these two totally different ways of cognitive dissonance. The kid they get, I put this in the book, and maybe this because I have my own kid, right? Is it the kid they wanted? You know, when you hear that the guy wore camel skin, you need to think that the hair was against his skin. Like this is a hair shirt. And, you know, John was probably like a pretty wacky guy. I mean, let's just be clear. You know, if you've seen The Last Temptation of the Christ, he looks kind of like a lunatic. You know, I mean, this is like somebody standing on a street corner with a sandwich board, like the end is near. Oh, hey, mom. Hey, dad. You know, like I think it's helpful to just think about that. And in some ways, they got what they wanted, but did they get what they wanted? And I don't know, like I resonate with that, to be honest. You know, like, I don't know how they found John. I don't know. And you know, Jesus is going to say, like, who are my mother and brothers? Not these people I'm related to. They're anybody that listens to what I have to say. Well, if I'd said that when I was 10, my mom minimally would have put me in my room. I mean, let's be clear. You know, so like there's this interesting parts of the story in which like, I just think the Bible resists like the standard happy ending. Like happily ever after it happens, it's just not like you thought it was going to be. And maybe like it's this push to like what joyfully ever after could be. I don't know, like it's this like tough thing. I don't know that I answered your question, Lila, but I think because these Torah stories were known, right? Jesus is not being cast as something different. He's being cast like, look, he's in the track of the Torah. Like people have been doing this thing, and here he is in this way. You know, like if you watched 8 o'clock this morning, I didn't know that I said it right, but like I'm almost pretty sure the Advent wreath comes from the Hanukkah. And maybe that's not exactly true, but there's enough truth in it that it's probably right. I don't know if that makes sense. Reminding us, yeah, absolutely, right? And there's this like big tendency we have, and Amy Jill Levine pointed this out, to read the scriptures in an anti-Semitic way. Like, oh, look, Jesus is like doing better what all those Jewish people messed up. I mean, that's anti-Semitism. And I think it explains why there's anti-Semitism rising again in the world, which I can't even understand that. You know, like I didn't understand why Christian people seem to hate Jewish people. It's just very strange to me. Was they don't think the Bible is saying Jesus is canceling all of that. The goal is Jesus is embodying all of that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you.
And I don't want to overstep. These are physically barren people, right? In a culture that judges their entire value in producing a male child. So that's real. And it's helpful to remember for me that some people find themselves in that situation. That was not my family situation, but when we went into the adoption process, there was a beautiful couple who had had 7 miscarriages. And this was it for them. They were going to adopt or they were going to be childless. And that story's real. And the story is also, I think, fair to say that, and I don't know your experience, but for me, I've had like barren years of my life. So I want to say both can be true at the same time. The story can literally continue to be true. And we can find ourselves in times of barrenness, despite doing everything we know to do that's right. And I resonate with having this kid, and then this kid was not what I thought I was going to have. And negotiating, I'm just going to say it, and you can judge me if you choose to. Negotiating disappointment. Negotiating like who wins, because I'm so used to like either my right way or their wrong way. What does reconciliation look like? Is it possible later? Like I'm doing that. And thank God I'm actually doing that. 3 years ago, I didn't know I was going to be doing that. I was settling for quiet instead of for peace, but I find myself doing this stuff with my getting ready to be 21-year-old son, who wasn't what I was hoping for. I'm just going to be honest. And to be honest, I probably wasn't what he was hoping for either. And now here we are, right? And like, to me, it invites this interesting thing when we talk about everyday living, where I was able to say in this reconciling moment, like, hey, I'm not actually sorry for what I did as your dad, because I did the best I could. I mean, I did, but I do wish I'd had more to give you. And like that both and of that, I can't be sorry because I did what I could. And I wish I'd had more. I feel like that's part of this story. I mean, I resonate with that part of this story, and it's very real. My mom has got 2 kids that do not have her faith. she probably worries about being liberal, and she worries about my brother being Jewish. And sometimes I enjoy that he's running interference for me because at least I'm under the Christian umbrella. But like, like this is just like where we are. I know my mom is not disappointed in me. She told me this really interesting thing one time that I hope Zechariah and Elizabeth said to their boy, hey, this isn't the life I would have picked for you, but I see the joy in it for you and your people. We don't know if Zechariah and Elizabeth said that to their John. We don't know. I hope they did. To me, this is powerful to be able to tell my 21-year-old, this isn't the life I would have picked for you. And I see the joy in your choices for you. Lila, I probably didn't cover what you wanted me to cover. Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
You're most welcome.
And thank you for putting the Hanukkah up with the Advent wreath today.
Well, it's the last day we can do it. Next year, Hanukkah goes over Christmas, it turns out. It's like December the 19th to the 26th. So we can do it then too. Adele, please.
I do really appreciate your efforts to help us find more commonality between our Christian faith and the Jewish faith and our commonness and our togetherness, because so many times I have felt in recent years, during the gospel reading, especially during Easter time, we hear so much, it seems to be, anti-Jews, that comes in, we hear it and we proclaim it together. And you just can't help but wonder, how does this continue to feed anti-Semitism? And we say, no, that's bad. But at the same time, we continue with these scriptures and making it a central part of our worship. And I don't see that that's ever going to be rewritten, but at least in other ways, maybe we can try to reinforce that we, how much we share together. And I don't know. So thank you.
I don't know if y'all know that the Gospelers are depicted iconographically in the same way that the cherubim are. So Matthew has the face of a human man. Mark has the face of a lion. Luke has the face of the ox, and John has the face of the eagle. And those are the faces the cherubim have in Ezekiel. The cherubim are not like fat babies. They're like monsters that have 4 faces on one head, and they're covered with eyeballs. And we don't have it at St. Thomas, but my last church has a lot of churches have a gospel cover. It's usually brass, or sometimes it's gold plated. They're monstrously expensive, but they depict the 4 gospelers iconographically: human, lion, ox, and eagle. And that sort of shrouds the iconic presentation of when you read the scriptures. And that is very Jewish, you see, because when you put the 4 together, you get like more eyeballs into the life and inside of Jesus. When you see Raiders of the Lost Ark, the thing looks wrong. It can't be 2 things that have wings touching, because they've got 6 wings and they've got 4 faces and they got eyeballs, and that just wouldn't be pretty. But that's the Ark of the Covenant. Sorry, Antha, I put that aside in when I think you might have just unmiked.
Not sure I unmiked, but I was just, I think that in the Middle Ages, didn't Jewish people have to hide in Europe on Good Friday? Because after the Passion Play was read, the Christians would go out and try to wreak some revenge for.
It's interesting. I used to live in a neighborhood in San Diego called Del Cerro, but it's also called Hanukkah Hill because there's a Reformed synagogue there. And I don't know if you've ever been by a synagogue on High Holy Days. It's usually like a line, and there's almost always private security. And to see an officer who may or may not be checking your bag to see if you've got a weapon on a high holy day, it breaks my heart. And it's the case, right? Like we went to a tea room up in Houston. We were there on Saturday morning, which is when you have like Torah school, right? And sure enough, at the Chabad, next to the tea room, there was private security.
That's going in the wrong direction.
Well, and I think, I think it's helpful to think like,
For it, not having security, but the reason for needing security is our society going in the wrong direction.
I'm starting to really think it's because like we have this latent anti-Semitism in the way we read the Bible. And I grew up that the Old Testament is the God of the law, but thanks be to Jesus, we have grace now, and those folks didn't have grace then. And that's the roots of anti-Semitism. I mean, you're saying that a way of life in which our Lord was born into is not only like inferior, but wrong. And Jesus wasn't a Christian. This is like really important to remember. Guy went to the temple to worship. Guy didn't think he was like starting a new religion. He thought he was fulfilling, like helping people live into the Torah that had always been there. I know we do things different customarily, right? But like the best expression I've got of that is like we all speak different dialects, or we speak different languages, and we've got our native tongue. But American English isn't actually superior to Hindi. I am Pieta. I was born into it. I probably could learn to speak Hindi as a second language, but the truth is American English is my native language. So at least for the first couple of years, I'll always be going Hindi to English, always, right? Until I can think and dream in English. And even then, right, my core idioms are going to be in English, not in Hindi. And so just remembering, I think that we find ourselves that way as Christians and Jewish folk, right? I feel like I need to say this too, even though maybe y'all don't need to hear it. One of my friends on Facebook posted like, America's a Christian country and we do this and this here, and if you don't like it, you can leave. And it's just sort of this interesting thing, right? Because like the person who posted that was born here. And like, we don't earn where we're born, we just are born, right? So to base this argument on like, you do it our way, because I earned it by my birth, is just bizarre to me. It's bizarre. In my evangelical background, which was like, hey, we need to go to Saudi Arabia and convert Muslims to Christianity so they don't go to hell. It's like, well, you know why they're Muslims? They were born Muslim. And do you know why you were born Christian? I mean, you know why you're Christians? Because you were like born into a Christian family, right? So what do you want? You want these people to lose their children, their spouse, their family, possibly their head, so they can accept the same religious propositions you were born into? That just seems real tough. And both the roots of anti-Semitism, anti-Islam, and xenophobia, right? I mean, like that, this all seems really, really tough. Rhonda, please.
That kind of leads into this thing I like at the very beginning, as the college chaplain with the student saying, I don't believe in God. And he says, tell me what kind of God you don't believe in. I probably don't believe in that one either. And I feel that, do any two people believe in God the same way? Maybe, but
I don't think that can be possible. Like Tim Kavula sent me this study on these identical twins who are like 35 and they're like regular athletes, right? And they were going to compare how one did on a standard like omnivore diet and one did on a vegan diet. And ultimately what the scientists said was that the greatest variance was not like what they ate, it was in the health of their gut biome. And that identical twins don't have the same gut biome, and that your gut biome makes like the 85% difference in what food does to your body. Which is just weird to think about, right? Because identical twins have the same DNA, and yet they have different gut biomes. Like, you know, it's just like interesting to think about. And I keep finding myself in this Enlightenment worldview where we use words and we think everybody understands the words we're saying like we're saying them. And there's a lot of variance in how people understand the words we're using. If you've ever been around children, you know this. It may be not that they're choosing to misunderstand you. It may mean the words mean something different to them. And that doesn't mean they're wrong. How we get good spiritual gut biomes, that seems pretty important to me. The authors of the study said that you should have, especially if you're going to be vegan, if you want that to pull off, you should have at least 30 different kinds of like plant-based foods each week to expose your gut biome to diversity so that you don't end up with like limited ability to fight antigens or pathogens, right? And it got me thinking, you know, like, hey, I grew up in the spirituality where there was one nutrient every week, one, instead of like 6 layers of dip, you know, like, so it seems like the more we can be exposed to, the healthier our spiritual gut biome can be.
Mike, I wonder if there's a contrast in how we treat other faiths. And people are waving. I'm confused.
They're going to church. They're leaving to go to church. Yeah.
Okay. All right. With what you have one of the early chapters about sympathy and empathy. So is going out to convert them, kind of telling your story over theirs, more like sympathy, and going to meet them and not with the goal of converting them, but to build bridges between different groups, if that's more like empathy.
Yeah, actually, and I don't want to sound like your renegade priest. I remember Annie Doyle coming on May the 12th and saying, what Philip did to the Ethiopian is listened to him. Didn't tell the eunuch what to do, listened to the eunuch, and that this is the invitation, is to go listen. Which I'm not always really good at. And I think it's really helpful. And now I can make a shameless plug that during Epiphany, on 5 Thursday nights at St. Thomas, we'll be hearing from 5 different religious leaders: the Tibetan Buddhist, the Imam, the conservative rabbi who went to a Reform seminary, and then I'm hoping the Unitarian who uses pronouns we, they, and the Bay Area Unity Church, which is different from the Unitarian. And I've invited them to say, what should Christians know about what you do? And is there a practice that's meaningful in your tradition that you could teach us with authenticity? And I do think it's really fair, Antha, is that like, and Brene Brown's done a really good job. All that language stuff kind of came from her stimulating, right? And you know, sometimes people talk about having empathy fatigue, and ultimately says you can't actually have empathy fatigue. What you have is fatigue from like holding sympathy back. But the more you can just empathize with somebody, the more you can actually just empathize with other people. Like the more you do it, the more you can do it. What's hard is when we're just holding, like, I really want to tell you what I think, and I have to hold that back, hold that back, hold that back. That's very fatiguing. When I can just let that down, then it's not so fatiguing, it turns out, according to her research. And this is where the language matters for me, and some of you guys must agree with it because you show up, you know, like this is where nonviolent communication is really, really helpful, right? Because it's I think, guiding us to like, how do we empathetically speak? How do we like do things without evaluating? Like, how do we observe? Because to me, that's like the gateway to empathy. When I start evaluating is when I start to become sympathetic or judgmental. Even when I say like, hey, thanks for your really generous gift to the church. Well, how do I know it was generous? What people gave is what they gave. So your giving to the church inspired me because it seems much more helpful and empathetic, to be honest. Okay, I know we're getting close to time. Any closing thoughts other than mine? Was it okay to read about 5 sections? Is that okay? I just want to cover Luke before I leave on April the 5th. That's my only real goal. So maybe we'll do chapters 5 through 9 for next week, if that's okay. Thank y'all. And not requiring you to come back, not expecting it, but grateful that you're here. Okay, see you soon. Take care.
Bye, y'all.